2,000 years ago from the island of Cyprus. That's kind of interesting because Cyprus does not have a wild cat population on it. So this cat must have been brought by ship, by boat, from mainland Middle East, from Turkey or the Levant, with its owner. Again, all of it suggesting that this was a close bond, a close attachment that these individuals had with these animals very early in human history. And of course, we can see this practice of keeping wild animals, tame wild animals as pets, very common among hunting and gathering populations. These images are taken from the Amazon region, where the practice of capturing and hand-rearing young wild animals is very, very common. It's almost ubiquitous. These animals are adopted as pets, and they're viewed and treated as other members of the family. They're kept for fun. They're not expected to provide any particular economic benefit or any kind of practical assistance, and they're never killed or eaten, even when they belong to a prey species like this peccary here. The process of hand rearing these animals, of course, means that they socialize very early on to their human family members. And they viewed both these humans and, of course, other pets in the community as their social partners. Sometimes, as adults, these animals are allowed to revert back into the wild. But interestingly, they may continue to be recognized as people's former pets when they're encountered by hunters. So the hunters won't kill the animal if they recognize it as being somebody's former pet. And this, habit of keeping animals for companionship continues to expand. This is just a chart showing levels of expenditure on pet foods between the period 2003 to 2017. This red line, very steep red line here, actually indicates Brazil. So you can see that in the country of Brazil, the amount people are spending on their pets has been going up very dramatically. China down here is interesting at the bottom. It's very, very flat until about 2011, 2012. And then we see the beginning of an exponential growth in pet keeping in China. This is, the trends are mostly upwards. A few countries like Japan actually showed a dip, but they're picking up again, it seems. So overall, this activity, which I'm calling pet keeping or cross-species adoption, whatever you want to call it, is been on the increase ever since it first appeared among hunter-gatherer groups back in the Paleolithic. So how do we explain it? What's this all about? Well, it does seem that at least ultimately the behavior probably originated from what you might call misdirected parenting. So there are a lot of studies by psychologists that have found that humans are selectively attracted to images of both animal and human infants. And these are so-called baby schema effects, or BSE. It turns out that women are more attracted to these baby schema effects than men are. Parents are more attracted to them than non-parents are. And that adult attraction gradually wanes, gradually declines as we get older. Sorry, was that a question? I couldn't hear.
No, Professor, I'm sorry. Someone has the microphone on.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
No worries. And it turns out that humans are also unique at least among primates, other primates, in their willingness to adopt and care for unrelated infants. So anthropologists take the view that this is a part of human, the part of the selection on humans early in their history was the ability to care for children cooperatively, so-called alloparenting. In other words, we're accustomed to looking after other people's infants. And so this kind of, as it were, lays us open to this possibility of adopting infants other than our own infants, including animal infants. And there's a sort of neurobiological basis for all of this. So in all mammals, the formation and maintenance of these kinds of social attachments is regulated by the neuropeptide hormone oxytocin and also arginine vasopressin. These hormones are very ancient. They occur at a very early stage in animal evolution, and they, at quite an early point, became involved in the regulation of parental care, in particular social bonding. And so in highly social species like our own, they have been, as it were, co-opted to help establish and maintain other kinds of social bonds and attachments. And also this release of oxytocin in the brain in response to social objects, or infants in this case, triggers the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is responsible for the kind of positive feelings of reward and motivation. So we're highly motivated to seek out these types of attachments. And also, oxytocin release suppresses the release of stress hormones such as cortisol through its effects on the HPA axis. And this has been known as social buffering. And it refers to the fact that when we are in a situation of extreme psychosocial stress, what people tend to do is look for a social partner. So we are drawn to others during moments of stress. And when we have these kinds of social engagements, it results in the release of oxytocin and suppresses our stress response. So we're highly motivated, as it were, to seek out social partners during times of stress. The root of the HPA axis from the hypothalamus down through the pituitary gland into the adrenal cortex, resulting in the secretion of cortisol and adrenaline. The real issue here is not so much the acute stress response, but the chronic stress response, when we're in a stressful situation that we can't get out of for some reason, and the stress builds. And we know that that has very negative effects on the immune system and various other processes in the body. And this provides us, if you like, with a possible mechanism to explain some of the positive health benefits of social support. Social relationships are life-saving. This is a chart taken from a meta-analysis, a meta-analytic review, where they looked at multiple studies and compared how mortality risk was reduced by different factors in people. And so there are some obvious things here, like people who are more physically active have their mortality risk reduced by about 20%, little over 20%. Being thin versus overweight, again, reduces your mortality risk by about 20%. What's important in this diagram is up here at the top, these are all measures associated with social relationships. So here, this was a measure of high versus low social support reported by individuals. And here we've seen a 60% reduction in mortality risk. Similarly, with this, a complex measure of social integration, how integrated people felt they were within their social group. Again, just over 60% reduction in mortality risk. The take-home point is that these social relationships are having a bigger impact than things that we conventionally think of as being healthy. So it's a very important take-home point. And this isn't confined to humans. There have been studies of non-human primates, for example, baboons, that have shown that, for example, female baboons who have friends, in other words, other baboons, which they spend a lot of time with, who they groom a lot or who are groomed by a lot. These baboons tend to live longer. They have more surviving offspring than the friendless females. And this is independent of their social rank or any other environmental or demographic factor. So again, having supportive social relationships is important for baboons as well as humans. And then the question is, well, can pets fulfill a similar kind of role for humans? And this is where stuff gets quite interesting and very complicated. So I've been a number of studies out of Japan at Azabu University. This was the earliest one, dating from 2009. The title kind of says it all. Dog's gaze at its owner increases owner's urinary oxytocin during social interaction. So they took a bunch of university students who owned dogs. They took urine samples. They asked them to give urine samples before the experiment. Then they sat them in a room with their dogs. And one group was told to just sit there and not interact with the dog at all. And the other group was asked to interact very gently with the dog, engage with it, talk to it, whatever they felt like doing, basically. And what they did find was that the groups who interact with their dogs showed higher levels of oxytocin at the end of the experiment when they gave a second urine sample. What was more interesting was that the levels of oxytocin increase that they showed was related to how much the dog looked at them, actually gazed at them, looked into their eyes. And it also, they did a sort of questionnaire with these folks before and after, and it turned out that the people who were looked at more by their dogs also reported having a stronger relationship with their dog. Even though they weren't aware that their dog looked at them more than the other people's dogs were looking at their owners, they still recorded stronger attachments for their dogs. So this raised a really interesting possibility that the animal, so to speak, is creating this positive feedback loop where the animal, by looking a lot at the owner, is triggering the release of oxytocin, which then makes the owner more likely to interact with the animal, and sort of reinforces that feedback loop, and produces this increase in oxytocin all the time. They did a subsequent study in 2015, which is more complicated still. Here, they identified two groups of dogs, which they called long gaze dogs and short gaze dogs. And so these were dogs that either looked at their owners a lot or dogs that didn't look at their owners much. And they also found a group of individuals who had hand-reared wolf pups and kept wolves as pets. And they compared these three groups. This was just looking at the amount that the three groups of animals looked at their owners. The black bars are the long gaze dogs. The white bars are the short gaze dogs. And the wolves are down here. You can't. Wolves basically don't look at their owners much, which is interesting. But you can see the long gaze dogs did indeed spend more time looking at their owners than the short gaze dogs. And reinforcing that, the owners tended to interact more with the long gaze dogs than with the short gaze dogs. The wolves are a bit anomalous here because they're actually spending a lot of time touching their wolves, but more so than they're touching the short gaze dogs. They also spend more time talking to the long gaze dogs. This is just some pre and post data, again, particularly up here, showing that the dark circles here are the long gaze dogs. These are oxytocin measurements taken from urine supplied before and after the experiment. And you see this big increase in oxytocin, but only in the groups with the long gaze. Other studies looking at oxytocin. This is a study that looked at oxytocin in plasma. So they had both the owner and the dog had indwelling venous catheters so they could take blood samples at intervals during the experiment. And what they found was that essentially before the experiment at baseline, they measured oxytocin, and then they looked at what happened after that. Unfortunately, put them both on the same scale, which gives you the impression that the owners don't change much. It's just that the owner change in the dogs is much more extreme than it is in the owners. So both the dogs and the owners are showing an increase in oxytocin secretion at the start of the interaction, and then it comes back down to baseline. What's kind of interesting was that both the dogs and the owner's oxytocin levels were positively correlated. So if the dog had a high score or a big change in oxytocin levels, so did the owner, and vice versa if the dog had a little change. Both owners and dogs' oxytocin levels were positively correlated with how often the owners reported kissing their dogs. This was a report using something called the Monash dog-owner relationship scale, which all of these owners completed at the beginning of the experiment. Also, owners reported their perceptions of the costs of dog ownership were negatively associated with the dog's oxytocin levels. So it's kind of, I guess you could argue that the dogs that are less rewarding, in other words, the dogs that are not stimulating such a big oxytocin response, are perceived generally as not as useful or something. So they're more costly. This was just a study of dogs. These are service dogs, but again, showing this very interesting response. But this time, instead of plasma, they looked at saliva. So this is salivary oxytocin. And we've got a pre and post design. The dogs were interacting with strangers, though, this time, and not with people they knew. But these were service dogs. These are dogs that are trained to help people with disabilities. And so they found that basically dogs who engaged in 10 minutes of positive human-animal interaction displayed these sort of dramatic increases in salivary and plasma. Oh, they looked at, sorry, I forgot. They looked at both salivary and plasma oxytocin. So they were validating, if you like, the salivary measure against a plasma measure. And they found that in both the saliva and plasma, oxytocin increased compared with a group of dogs which were simply in a room with another individual, another human, but they didn't interact with the human, or the human didn't interact with them. And the dogs who displayed this higher level of interaction with the humans, sort of behavior such as seeking contact with the human, trying to play with the human, or licking the human, or soliciting a sort of belly rub, in other words, rolling over on their backs. During this interaction, these were the dogs that exhibited this largest increase in oxytocin levels. So all of this is pointing to the fact that not only are we finding these interactions rewarding, but the animals are finding the interactions rewarding as well, and are seeking them out. And this is something quite different between dogs and wolves. You can tame wolves, and people have kept them as pets, but they don't show this type of behavior, this intense desire to engage with people visually and to interact with them socially. Just one interesting point to get across here is that this may, there are differences obviously between dogs as well. Some dogs are very good at this and some dogs are not so good. And it turns out that this may have a genetic basis, in the sense that people have looked at polymorphisms in the oxytocin receptor gene in different breeds of dogs. And they found distinct differences. There are SNPs in dogs that don't occur in wolves, like the AG and GG polymorphisms have not been found in wolves. Wolves mainly have this AA version. No, sorry, it was the other way around. Yeah, wolves don't have the AA version, but I think they do have the AG and GG version. Anyway, this study just looked at the amount of proximity-seeking behavior in dogs with these different, showing these different polymorphisms, and it was the dogs with the AA variant that show the highest rates of interaction with people. That's a sort of spontaneous desire to seek proximity with people. So that's quite an interesting insight again, that we've selected, as it were, for variants in the population that make these animals more likely to seek us out for these types of positive social interactions. And this has led some people to argue that that dogs, or at least some dogs, are providing what you might call a supernormal stimulus. Now, the supernormal stimulus idea was originally proposed by the Dutch ethologist Nico Tinbergen way back in the 1950s. And he defined it as any stimulus that elicits a stronger response than the stimulus for which that response originally evolved. And his example, natural egg here. And what Tinbergen did was he provided them with giant eggs that, you know, looked like 10 times the size. And what he found was that incubate this giant egg rather than their own natural egg. And this provided this argument that as it were, the seagull is primed to respond to certain stimulus properties of the egg. And if you nudge or exaggerate those stimulus properties, trying to incubate or care for it might be that, in a way, this is something that dogs have done for us. We have, as it were, selected for characteristics in these animals that have turned them into supernormal stimuli for our kind of nurturing and parenting responses. And certainly when you look at some of the characteristics that we've bred into these animals, that kind of starts to feel very plausible, that sort of argument. We have generated animals that look more and more like human infants in many respects, but in an even more exaggerated way. This little thing here looks like a Pokemon almost. It's a very strange looking thing. And we also know that in humans, of liking a trend in dogs. So the studies have found that the tendency for looking at humans in a communication situation seems to be a genetic predisposition in dogs, while it is difficult to induce this type of behavior in young wolves, even though we know dogs are derived from wolves. We've done other things to dogs that enhances all of this. So this is a study that looked at aspects of facial anatomy, looked at the muscles that move the face and create facial expressions. Turns out that there are two muscles in dogs. The dogs are on the left-hand side of this diagram, and the wolves are on the right-hand side. Two muscles in dogs, these two here, that are absent or extremely vestigial in wolves. And these muscles move the eyebrows, so they move these types of things. And they give dogs this very, very expressive face. And the theory is that under domestication, we've selectively altered dogs' facial expressions to enhance their ability to produce these kind of sad and reproachful looks that trigger, again, our sympathy, our desire to look after them and care for them. And indeed, they actually did a study to look at whether it made any difference to whether or not people adopted dogs from dog shelters And it turns out that dogs that had these more prominent eyebrow type facial expressions were more likely to be adopted from animal shelters than those with less obvious eyebrows. So again, it suggests that we are, at some unconscious level, we are definitely responding to these characteristics. So is pet keeping good for our health? Well, certainly all of this sort of previous evidence with oxytocin and everything suggests that it should be. If pets are acting as social support providers, which we suggest they might be, then we ought to see clear evidence that pet keeping is good for our health. Unfortunately, it's not clear-cut. It's complicated. Some studies, and I'll go through some of the main ones, do indeed seem to suggest that pet ownership is associated with health benefits or survival benefits, but other studies have found no effect of pet keeping at all on health measures. And a few studies have even found negative effects of pet keeping on health measures. So in some ways, the jury is still out, but I just want to mention a couple of studies here. This was the first study really. This study triggered an entire field of research looking at the health benefits of pet ownership. It was conducted by a graduate student at the University of Maryland way back in the late 1970s, Erica Friedman. She was studying people who had experienced heart attacks, and she followed these individuals up for a year after they were, sent home from hospital. And she interviewed them and gave them questionnaires and asked them about all aspects of their social lives. And then at the end of a year, she looked at how many of them had survived for a year following a heart attack and how many had died. And then she looked at the social factors and how they contributed to the likelihood of them living or dying for 1 year after a heart attack. And she, in a way that was very prescient, really, she had in her questionnaire questions about pet ownership. Up to this point, I have to emphasize, no one had taken pet keeping seriously. So it was just regarded as something strange that people did. And no one had really considered, what the impact of it might be on pet owners. So Erica was really the first person to put a question in there in her survey about pet ownership. And she found, when she did her analysis, that the people with pets were much more likely to be alive after 1 year than the people who had no pets. The initial response to that was to assume that it was because these people were dog owners and they got more exercise from walking their dogs. So she looked at the people who had pets other than dogs. And the effect remained. It's a very small sample size here. So there's only 10 people who had pets other than dogs. But still, it's 10 to 0 in terms of who survived for 1 year, which suggested that it wasn't just, something to do with additional exercise. It was more to it than that. This is coming forward, kind of a similar study in many ways, but a very large national cohort study conducted in Sweden, a very large, over 181,000 people here, just looking at risk outcomes, hazard ratios, they call them here, for acute myocardial infarction and also ischemic stroke in this population. This gray line, as I understand it, the 1 here, represents the sort of the average probability of a stroke in these different, in the Swedish population as a whole. And so these are like standardized scores. And what's interesting here is that these are the pet owners, and they're all showing reduced risk for these types of conditions, like mortality due to myocardial infarction or stroke. What I think is kind of interesting here is that the strongest reduction is among people living alone for both criteria. And that would kind of, again, suggest that we're dealing with a social function here from pet ownership, a social effect, that people living alone are benefiting the most. This is, I'm going to skip over these two because we're running out of time. This is just a study that tends to reinforce the idea of pets acting as a social buffer against stressful situations. This was an early study by Judith Siegel. Again, she had a large population of, I think, over 2,000 elderly people. And she just followed them over a period of time and measured how often they went to their doctors, basically. So that was the outcome variable. How often did they seek out a medical attention for any kind of medical problem? And then she looked at what factors in their lives predicted that. And very unexpectedly, things like chronic health problems predicted that. Income, being in a low income group, predicted that. We know that people in low income groups are more susceptible to many types of medical problems. Life events, so these are stressful events in the person's life, predicted more medical visits, which you would also expect because we know that stressful life events can have an impact on your health. Pet keeping on its own did not have any impact. However, there was a really interesting interaction effect between life events and pet keeping. In other words, those individuals who had pets were not affected by life events. People without pets were. It reinforces the idea that the pet being to buffer us. So again, very, very early, just looking at minor health problems. And this was the reason I'm drawing attention to it, because it was the first study really that did was longitudinal. It was prospective. I managed to capture people in animal shelters before they actually took their pet home, and made them fill in questionnaires before they left the shelter with their pet. And then I followed them up for a period of time, 1 month, 6 months, and 10 months later. And this just showed, I used a standardized questionnaire that asked them about the number of health problems they'd experienced in the previous month. At baseline, there was a control group of people who had no pets who were actually selected by the experimental groups as being similar to them, but not having pets. And at baseline, you can see they're all the same. They all have roughly the same number of minor health problems. But after 1 month, there's this big drop in both the dog and cat owning group compared with the control group. The dog owners retained that effect for 6 months and indeed 10 months. Cat owners less so, but we had a much smaller sample size of cat owners. So that may not be, that may be due to a sample size effect. But no change in the control group. So again, it's an indication that getting these animals might actually impact us in an immediate sense in terms of our health. And finally, this major study that was done is a really interesting study in many ways, but it was a randomized controlled trial, if you like. Not an easy thing to do because you can't give someone a pet and they don't know about it. So you can't give them, there's no placebo. But what they did was they identified this group of 48 people with high blood pressure. They gave one group a drug designed to reduce blood pressure, and they told the other group, they also gave drugs to the other group, but they also told them to get a pet. And they could choose whether to get a pet cat or a pet dog. And then all the subjects received tests to measure their response to stressors. There were things like mental arithmetic or reading tasks, speech tasks that were mildly stressful. And then they followed them up over a period of time, I think 6 months later. And what they found at the end was that the group 2, this group that got a PET, exhibited much reduced reactivity to these stressful tasks on all of the things they measured, like heart rate, blood pressure, and so on, compared with the group 1 subjects who had just the drug. You can see that here, but I don't want to overrun too much. But we've got, this is a resting condition, this is a stressful math test, this is resting condition again, and this is a stressful speech test. This is the before condition. The gray bars, I think, are the PET group. The black bars are the group that just gets the drug. And this is the after condition. And you can see that the people who got the drug are very similar in terms of their responses to these stresses, but the 2 PET groups are showing a much reduced stress response. Again, in some ways implying this buffering effect of the PET in terms of people's responses to stress. I'll skip that one, I'll skip that. So the evolutionary implications are that dogs and probably other companion animal species have been selected for their ability to serve as kind of supernormal oxytocin releasers and social support providers. Ancestrally, the animals that were better at doing this received better care from their human partners and therefore had more surviving offspring. So there was a sort of human selection, artificial selection for these individuals that could do this better. Unfortunately, selection for these traits is ongoing, and we've got to the point now of it causing significant welfare problems in many companion animals through the effects it's having on the anatomy and to some extent the behavior of the animals. That was going to be the second half of my talk, but I think I've run out of time. Yeah. I'd be happy to address any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Professor James CECSBE. But your lecture is very interesting. So now we were open to ask your questions. Professor James, someone?
Yes. I can't.
Professor,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I would like to know if there is any evidence that another population kept another animals as pigs since earlier than dogs or cats, or if they are like the first, or like even monkeys because they look more like us and have this facility to communicate with us, or I don't know, maybe cows in India. I don't know how it works there because they don't have this relationship to gain something from it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think if you look at modern hunter-gatherers, they keep all kinds of animals as pets. They keep monkeys, they keep birds, they keep pigs, they keep every kind of animal you can think of. And most of these, almost all of these animals, if they don't die eventually, they then sort of wander off back into the forest when they get too big, basically. Some of them stick around. I've heard an example of a group of Indians living in Peru, in the forests in Peru, who keep tapirs as pets. Do you know what I mean by tapir? Great big animal. And
No.
these, yeah, with a funny nose, yeah, like a sort of small elephant. And these tapirs grow up to be fully adult, but they stay around the village, and the children play with them and interact with them, and they just stay there. They feed themselves. They don't need to be fed by anybody, but they stick around. And I think this is, if you like, is the model for animal domestication. I don't think, you need, I understand no one ever domesticated the tapir, but it's nevertheless, it's creating a kind of context in which you can imagine some animals continue to become dependent on the people, and then they breed in that environment and produce another generation of babies which are dependent on people, until eventually you've got, two separate populations. You've got the wild population, you've got the domestic population. And what distinguishes those two populations is probably their ability to exist and breed and maintain a population that lives in association with people. And the reason why, we didn't domesticate monkeys, or we didn't domesticate parrots, or all these other different animal species, is probably due to the fact that they just don't adapt as well to that situation, which suggests that maybe, the reason why we have dogs is because wolves did adapt well to that situation. Cats also, they adapted well to that situation. But you need this transitional period from just adopting the animal, keeping it until it's grown up, and then letting it go again, to adopting an animal, keeping it, but then letting it stay close and helping to maintain it as a separate population from the wild one. And then you get genetic isolation between the wild population and the domestic population. And that's how I see things happening, at least sort of historically. But we don't have a lot of proof, because it's really hard to see this type of process in the fossil record, or in the archaeological record.
Very nice. Anyone?
James, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what is the status of research in human-animal interactions, considering your lifetime contribution. Do you think, are we making real progress on a standard this type of research?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of progress. So I think, some of the early studies, including my own, were badly designed, were small sample sizes, not good control groups, these types of problems. And nowadays, people are much more aware of this and the need to design really good studies that try and deal with many of the confounding variables that exist in these types of studies. As I said earlier, it's you can't do the traditional clinical placebo-controlled trial. You just can't do it, because you can't give someone an animal and they don't know they've got an animal. So you have to use more ingenious designs. You have to use prospective designs. And I think my general impression is that the quality of the research has improved enormously. And some interesting findings are coming out. I think the take-home message from those more recent studies is that this is a complex phenomenon, and it's not, it's not clear-cut. You can't say, oh yes, pets are always good for us. They're not. It very much depends on the nature of the relationship with the animal, and that would be determined not only by the person but also by the animal. So if you have a really good positive relationship with your pet, then yes, probably you are going to experience benefits from that. But if your pet has behavior problems, or your pet is, bites the neighbors, that's going to be a source of stress for you. and not necessarily beneficial at all. It could actually be detrimental. So people are, I think researchers in the field are coming to recognize that this is a complex problem. It requires a more nuanced approach than maybe in the past, when we had sort of very optimistic assumptions about what kind of findings we would get when we looked at this.
Thank you.
Professor, recently I watched a TV show about that interesting case of a dog that communicates with its owner using that sound tags, and it was amazing the number of phrases of the dog they are learning to communicate with its owner. Do you think that the pets are becoming more intelligent?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there are lots of people studying dog cognition, you know, and designing these very, very complicated experiments to see what they're capable of doing, and trying to determine if dogs have what they call a theory of mind. In other words, can as it were, anticipate what people are thinking and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it stands to reason that at least some dogs, and I guess what I mean here is some breeds of dogs, might have been very intensely selected for those types of abilities. So I'm thinking of like dogs that work very closely in cooperation with their owners, the herding dog breeds like the Border Collie. These dogs seem to outperform other breeds on many of these cognitive tests. And that would make sense when you understand what they have to do in the wild, or not in the wild, but what they have to do when they're working, because they have to not only pay attention to what the sheep are doing, but they have to pay attention to what the instructions they're getting from the handler, from the owner, often conveyed through whistles or gestures at long distances. A lot of it's about trying to anticipate both what the handler wants of the dog. So you could see, you know, a good reason why those particular breeds would develop more sophisticated cognitive capacities to deal with that type of situation. But you know, if you were to compare that breed with, say, a beagle, which is just a dog that chases with its nose, you would probably not expect a beagle to be very good at these kinds of things.
Someone else?
Yeah. You don't think, Professor, this type of selections make people more frustration because they like some type of perfect dog, not some perfect dog, they just become abandoned animals?
I couldn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, she asked whether or not this type of expectations, when not met, are making people more frustrated and being a cause of abandonment.
I think so, yes. We have, I have quite a lot of data indicating that, for example, people who take their dogs to an animal shelter, relinquish their dog to an animal shelter or surrender it to a shelter, that those dogs have worse behavior problems than dogs that are still living in their homes. What's interesting is if you ask these people directly whether their dog has any behavior problems, they say no. In fact, they say the dog has less behavior problems than your average pet owner would. But if you ask them specific questions about the dog's behavior, then it turns out the dog has lots of problems. Now, it's hard to know how to interpret that. It may be that at some level, they're trying to conceal the fact that the dog has problems, or it may be that they don't even know. So they may be they don't have enough experience of dogs to be able to say whether the behavior is a problem or not. Maybe they think it's normal for the dog to bite the neighbors, but it's just something they can't live with. So they take the dog to the shelter, but they don't recognize that it's a problem. They just think, oh, well, that's the way dogs are. And I think it's important that we we try and get to grips with that sort of problem, because I think if we could solve that problem, it would be enormously beneficial, because you'd be able to intervene with these people before they take the animal to the shelter. And you'd be able to say to them, oh, okay, you have a particular issue with this dog, and we can help you correct it. So you don't have to take it to the shelter. You can solve the problem. This is not normal. You shouldn't think that this is normal for dogs. You should think this is a problem that can be fixed. And I think that's a really important direction for future research.
Can I just make a comment? That's exactly the work. Remember this Zero Abandon project that we launched when you came here?
Yeah.
The students we are working in 3 different schools. In fact, Marcy's school supervisor students are here, and they're talking to the students about what is normal about a dog behavior. And it's been amazing how disconnected, even kids that are dog owners, what is normal for a dog to do, and then we'd like to call you in another time to share some of our data. It looks really exciting. We are working 3 different schools with quite elaborate questions in relation to human kids from fundamental school to high school, looking to this, how they recognize behaviors and whether or not by teaching would improve the human-dog relationship.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to see that.
We make sure that we get back to you with more time and kind of explain the type of project you're doing. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your participation. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.